Hello and welcome to this series of leadership conversations in which I'm in conversation with the chairs of not-for-profit organizations to hear about their experience of being chair of their organizations during 2020. So 2020, during the COVID pandemic, presented all sorts of extraordinary and unprecedented challenges to not-for-profit organizations. And I'm curious to see how the role of chair evolved and what the experience of being chair was like. And today I'm joined by Ruth Barrington, and Ruth chairs two organizations that are going to be the feature in the conversation today. So she's the chair of TROR, which is the National Federation of Services for Unmarried Parents and Their Children, and also chair of the St. John of God's Research Foundation. Welcome, Ruth. Thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. So perhaps we could begin by you introducing yourself. So tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Yes, Kieran, thank you. Ruth Barrington is my name. And as you said, I chair TROR and the St. John of God's Research Foundation. I'm retired. I spent most of my life in the public service. I worked in the Department of Health. I was the chief executive of the Health Research Board. I worked for the universities for a short while as chief executive of an organisation called Molecular Medicine Ireland. I've done a few other things. I was on the board of the VHI for a while, and I was a governor of the Irish Times and chaired the trust, the Irish Times Trust, and was a director of the board of the Irish Times. So I'm married. I have 5 grandchildren, which keep me busy, as well as my voluntary activities.
Great. All right. Thanks very much for that introduction and for a very full introduction. So you bring a lot of experience of both working at the governance level on the boards, but also at an executive level, and in a variety of different organizational types in terms of public sector and not-for-profit. So maybe we could start with, give us a sense of what was going on the boards of both organizations prior to COVID-19 hitting. So I'm always trying to develop almost like a before and after picture. So if you cast your mind back to January, February 2020, what were the concerns? And then also, what was your sense of what the year was going to be like?
Well, as ever, funding is an issue. So we were getting our budgets ready for the year and hoping that we could persuade our funders to make funding available. We have a number of funders in TROR. So there's various applications have to be sent out and sorted. In the St. John of God's, it's slightly different. There's a single source of funding, but again, one is always conscious of that. In both organizations, we have a strategy around how our activities are governed and our priorities. So that was important. In both cases, we had well-established chief executives who've been with us for 3 or 4 years in both cases. So they're well settled into the job, performing very well, and not a very good relationship with the board. So that was working well. So it was kind of business as normal, getting on with the issues. There are lots of it in terms of unmarried parents and their children. There are a whole range of policy issues that we're concerned with, that we want to address and change and remove the discriminations against those parents and their children. So yeah, things were looking good, and we were confident of making a fair degree of progress last year.
So that was January, February. So what you're describing there, it sounds like it was going to be a usual year, let's say. Lots of work to be done, but similar themes in terms of strategy, funding and things like that. So that's
nobody was predicting anything radical. No radical change predicted for the year as far as we were concerned.
Okay, like we were all in that position. So then, as in March, as COVID began to make its appearance felt, and organizations then began having to respond with the first lockdown, give us a sense of how. Well, my sense is that boards went through different phases.
Yeah.
So maybe give us a sense in March, April, how the boards were responding to that challenge.
Well, I suppose, as you know, there was a great deal of uncertainty. So everybody was watching, listening, waiting for advice, guidance. And then I suppose the major step was the advice from governments that everybody should work from home. So that essentially put an end to our staff traveling into work. It put an end to board meetings in person. So the question then was, well, how do we keep the show on the road? Do we kind of let staff go and look for some kind of COVID payments, or can we keep the organization intact and working during essentially a lockdown, the first lockdown? So we very much look to our CEOs for advice as to what to do, and in both cases, the immediate response is, look, with the new technology, we can operate from home. We just have to set people up with access to files, maybe improve their IT, but it's going to be possible to continue to provide our services remotely. And also in both cases, the CEOs responded by saying, and we'll stay in touch with staff, because everybody wondered how on earth you could keep a team going without, remotely, how could you do it? But in both cases, they set up online meetings with them, even occasional coffee mornings, maybe once a week, just to have a cup of coffee together without any business being conducted, but just to keep the collegiality going and the team spirit. And I suppose conscious too that staff would have been feeling a bit isolated and maybe a bit uncertain about their future and what was happening. So it's important to reassure them. So in both cases, I suppose I wasn't sure if this was all possible, but in both cases, it worked out extraordinarily well, and staff responded amazingly. And, the services that both organizations provide continue to be provided throughout the pandemic.
Okay. So a rapid phase of learning about how to do it logistically in terms of continuing to offer the service, and then also supporting staff through it. What was your usual board pattern? So had the board a pattern in terms of this before COVID, in terms of meeting monthly or every 6 or 8 weeks, and had your subcommittees? Give me a sense of that, because I'm curious to see if that structure persisted through COVID or had to be revised.
Yeah, we in both organizations we meet more regularly in Throw. It's about every 5 weeks, and with St. John God's Research Foundation, we meet 4 to 5 times a year.
Okay.
But we haven't missed a meeting throughout the pandemic because of the technology, because of Zoom. We have been able to continue to meet remotely, and the extraordinary thing is that there's probably a better attendance at our meetings on Zoom than there was when we were meeting in person, because people didn't have to travel. They they didn't miss their bus or their train or whatever it is that could delay people from getting, or caught in traffic, the usual one. I've found in both cases the attendance has been really excellent on Zoom, and people have been really engaged. We even have 1 or 2 directors who are outside the country. They found themselves outside when the pandemic began, and they haven't come back, and even they have contributed, have joined in, depending on the strength of the broadband, they have joined in and contributed. So again, there's great resilience, I think, and thanks to, we meet in both cases, we meet by Zoom. And I have to say, I found Zoom a very easy technology to use to chair a meeting, particularly when you can see all the faces online. The only snag is when the broadband is poor in somebody's part of the world or part of the country, and they have difficulty signing on or signing in.
Did you find that the boards had to meet more frequently?
No, we didn't.
We were able to sustain that level. So,
yeah.
So I'm curious if I think in terms of, so it's probably middle of March, just around St. Patrick's Day, when the first lockdown was announced, and then let's say the end of April, by that period of lockdown, trying to get the services, sustain the services, get staff working from home, that kind of stuff. Was there any change in the pattern of communications between you and the CEOs? So again, I'm trying to contrast. So maybe under normal circumstances, how much contact would you have with the CEOs of both organizations? And then what level of contact did you have during the early stages of the lockdown?
Well, I'd be in reasonably regular contact, at least once a fortnight with the CEOs. One stage was probably a bit more frequent than that, particularly with Thror, because we have an information service to offer, which has to be available every day, well, every working day, and that was important that we could keep that going. So we did discuss that and the arrangements in place to make sure that that service was available. We've put more information on our website, so that's, I think, helped. But so, yeah, I mean, there were times when we were maybe ringing each other once a week, but nothing, lots of emails and text messages and contact like that, but nothing too, no panic, it's just,
But was it taking more time? I'm curious to see if it required more time on your.
Well, yes, it probably did, in the sense that you had to think about things that you hadn't had to think about before, particularly about the welfare of staff and the team, and could the organization operate remotely, and then preparing for board meetings, just how to handle it. Once it took a little while, I think, to get on top of the Zoom technology, but once people did, it worked very well. But it probably took me a little while to get my head around just chairing a meeting on Zoom and making sure that you're bringing everybody in. But no, I mean, it wasn't. I can't say that. Well, in one sense, the time I saved in traveling to and from various buildings around the city for meetings, I probably put into, a bit of extra time with the CEOs, a bit more time on email.
Yeah. So what was after the initial phase then, what was occupying the board's attention for the remainder of the year? So if typically you'd be talking about funding and strategy and things like that, what was on the board's agenda, or the both boards?
Well, we have a CEO report in both cases, and in both of those they would have reported on the arrangements and how they were working for staff, and how what we could keep going. I mean, in terms of the research foundation, there's no doubt that some of the research activities were delayed because you couldn't recruit patients for studies, during the pandemic, or it was much more difficult to recruit staff to work on research studies. So there was some slowdown, and we did consider that, but there was nothing really as a board that we could do about that. But no, I mean, we once we were reassured that as far as possible the team was continuing to provide the services, we focused on the other issues facing us, which were, how do we pursue the mission of both organizations and make sure we're there. In Thror, it was fascinating that a particular issue emerged early on in the pandemic, which was the refusal of parents who were sharing the care of a child, parents who weren't living together, who were sharing the care of a child, where one parent was refusing to transport the child to the other parent, even though there might have been a court order requiring shared parenting. So our CEO very effectively led a publicity campaign to alert government to this issue. He authored a letter in the Irish Times and wrote to the Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan, at the time. Minister Flanagan took it so seriously that he phoned him on a Saturday morning to discuss the issue with him. And shortly afterwards, the Department of Justice issued advice to parents that they must honour court orders, and that bringing children to the other parent was considered an essential service. So, that took a little bit of time of our board, but it was a very useful clarification, and I think a useful intervention.
What would you say the contribution of the board was to the organisation, or to both organisations? There might have been a different sense of different contributions from both during 2020.
Yeah, well, I mean, supporting the CEO, I saw as the main role of the board during the first part of the pandemic, given these challenges to trying to keep the show on the road. I mean, the CEOs were working from home as well, so they were challenged. But the board, I think, in both cases, the board was very supportive of the CEO, very encouraging of the CEO, and very grateful to the CEO and the staff for the efforts that they made to keep the activities of the organisation going during this, what was a very difficult time for them.
Okay, so a key role of the board then is supporting the CEO, and
well, as ever, a key role of the board is supporting the CEO. But in this case, it was a bit more, I suppose, it was more necessary than ever for the board to be seen to be supporting the CEO, and through the CEO to be supporting the team in the efforts they were making. Okay. And I hope we tried, because we were constantly asking the CEO to thank the staff for the efforts they had made.
Okay.
I mean, one with the St. John of God's Foundation, one of the things which we discussed in some detail was there's an annual research day held every year that under the auspices of the foundation. And this year, of course, we couldn't hold it in person, even though it was the 30th anniversary of this particular research day. So the team got together and planned a fantastic 3-day online seminar in which experts from all over the world contributed their papers, their ideas about research in mental health and intellectual disability, and old people's psychiatry, and followed up then by contributions from the research active members of the St. John of God's services. And it really was a stunning event, which it certainly reached a wider audience than it would have reached if it had been held, if everybody had required to go in person to the one place to hear these people speak. Okay. So I took my hat. We all took our hat off on the board to the ingenuity of staff and their resilience.
So did you discover new things about both of the organizations?
Well, I think this, I can now fairly safely say that we have two very resilient organizations. I mean, well, the St. John of God's, what can one say? I mean, they've been around since 1500s, so they have been through many challenges and crises and have come through. Thrower has been around for 50 years or so. So again, there's been, a lot of tries, but never had to come through a pandemic like this before. But no, I think very relieved that we have survived intact. We haven't, in neither case have we lost any staff. They've stayed with us, they've stuck with us, they're contributing hugely to keeping the show on the road. Have we advanced our mission during the pandemic? I think that might be a bigger question. I think we've managed to tread water, but perhaps we haven't really made as much progress as we might have liked. Okay.
And I'm wondering then, so organizations, when they develop their strategies, they make assumptions about what the world's going to be like, and some of those assumptions are often unconscious assumptions. So when you go through a period of rapid change and unprecedented change, sometimes you think, actually, maybe we need to do things differently as a result, because you've been forced to do things differently. So I'm wondering, are there any learnings or insights for either organization coming out about your strategy, for example, as a result of the...
Well, I don't think about the strategy, because I think in both cases what we're about is is independent of whether there's a pandemic or not. Though in the case of the research, I think one of the things it threw up was the opportunity to undertake research on the impact of the pandemic on the delivery of health services in St. John of God's, and that's underway. But with Torno, I think the biggest impact will be on the shape of the office as we know it when the pandemic is over. The fact that technology is now so effective in helping people to work from home, I think there's going to be more flexibility. Though, I mean, for any board would have to balance the wish of staff to work from home with the sense that that's all very well if you have a team that knows each other and works well together and shares the value of the organization. I'm not quite so sure how well that would work with new staff who have never worked in the same environment, who don't know and trust each other. So I think there's going to be a balance struck between there'll be more flexibility in the workplace for people to work at home, but maybe I'm old-fashioned on this, but I think there is merit in people actually sharing space together and sharing coffee in person together, and you know, building up that kind of personal trust and personal understanding.
Okay.
Maybe
a different balance will be struck between.
I think possibly, yeah.
And so as you look at, now we're in early February 2021. What's the year ahead looking like for both organizations?
Well, funny, we were, as I said, last year and this time last year and this time this year, we're always concerned about our finances and is the funding there. So in both cases, the funding is there. It has been committed. We actually underspent in Flora last year. Better not talk about that too loud, but because we couldn't hold. Actually, one thing we couldn't do is have the in-person workshops. That it's one of the valuable things we offer to staff working in the wider health and social services, and we couldn't do that this year because of the pandemic. There were some online ones held, but we just save money in travel and hotel, and you know, so it's not big money, but we did save some money. So yeah, funding wise, it looks, you know, both organizations are secure for the next year at least. We live from year to year. As I say, staff are with us and are working well. We've actually recruited one new member of staff in the past year in one organization, which went very well. So now that I suppose I wouldn't call this the new normal, but now that things have kind of settled a bit, we do want to get back to some of the more policy-oriented issues, addressing some of the, as I said earlier, in relation to unmarried parents, some of the discriminations that are there built into our system, with St. John of God's Research Foundation to continue to build the culture of research throughout the St. John of God services, and to use whatever means we can. It won't be person to person, we'll have to use technology to do that, but I've no doubt that staff will come up with ways of addressing both challenges.
Okay, so so as you look then at the last year and your role as chair, I'm curious about, so you have a lot of experience of governance and executive and everything like that. So I'm really curious, were there things in the year that you were challenged by, or did you take everything in your stride? No. Yeah, I'm curious, given your experience, I'm curious, was there a challenge, or were there challenges for you in the year?
Well, I think I mean, you look back now at last year and you say, oh my goodness, such incredible change, but it all happened incrementally. I mean, we didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. So initially you were thinking, oh, well, this is, you know, a month or two, we'll be back to normal and this will all be behind us. And, you know, it's only kind of gradually dawned as the changes were made, we realized, no, this is going to go on much longer. Just as we are this year, realizing that, well, we may have thought that the vaccination program will solve our problems, but now we hear, no, we're, you know, it could be well into next year before we're getting back to normal. So I think it's coming to terms with the long-term implications of all of this, that, you know, how resilient are our organizations going to be for another year of working like this? I think that's, and, you know, and you would, I mean, some staff, there are staff with small children, for instance, who are trying to, you know, work and look after small kids, and the creches are closed and the schools are closed, and you'd just be concerned about their well-being, you know, just their resilience.
Okay, because it's dragging on, or
it's dragging on. Yeah, I mean, that's the.
If you knew then what you know now, so if you knew back in March or April what you know now, that it's going to continue in the way that, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I suppose we might have planned a bit more. I mean, a lot of it was just, you know, very, very reactive. Whatever the latest advice from government was, you know, we had to put it into effect, whether it was working from home or wearing masks or, you know, it all seemed, you know, rather mechanical. I think we might, and maybe that's what we have to do now for the year ahead. We have to sit down and say, well, look, we're not going to be able to meet again in person for another year. We're not going to be able to pursue all our objectives as in both organizations. So what are the 2 or 3 things we should really try and focus on this year, and try and make progress on them, rather than try and, you know, keep the whole show on the road, which I suppose we were trying to do last year.
Okay. And so kind of prioritize.
Yeah, well, you know, on board you're always doing that anyway, but
yeah.
I think we now that it looks as if we're really, you know, there's another year at least in this, we should be thinking a little bit more long term about what we can achieve as boards.
Okay. And then in terms of your role as chair, are there things that you're learning about what it means to be a chair as a result of the last year?
Well, I suppose the relationship with the CEO really comes to the fore, and I mean, you should never take that relationship for granted, but certainly in the past year, it would have been very foolish to do so, because I mean, the role of the chair or the role of the CEO is just so critical. So working closely with the CEO and keeping the communication going and keeping the just the morale up, because in some ways the CEOs had much, they had to answer the questions of staff and people who service users, or why isn't this available, and where are you, and we can't call to your office, and you know, so they have borne, you know, a bigger load, I think, than the chairs and members of the boards have. So just I really, I suppose, brought home the importance of the chair CEO relationship and making sure that's working well.
Okay. Anything else that you're learning about the role of chair?
Well, also, I suppose, keeping in touch with the board members. I suppose I've probably done more offline communication with board members than I would have done normally, because normally you'd if there was an issue to discuss with a board member, you'd meet them over a cup of coffee and you'd say, you know, do you really disagree with that, or what do you think we should do about this? Whereas you have to do that either by phone or, you know, by email now. So yeah, staying in touch with the board is more difficult, that's for sure, because you don't have that informal opportunity to chat and talk and resolve issues. But as I say, what has been really wonderful has been to see the engagement of board members with the board and the business of the board, by, you know, joining the Zoom meetings and contributing.
Okay. So what you're describing there is just so the relationship with the CEO is really, really important, and the relationship then with other board members is really important. Trying to hope to invest in both of those.
That's right.
So the role of the chair is a really interesting one, because you're kind of the fulcrum between the board and the executive.
Yeah.
What was that experience like in the last year, managing that? And there's often inevitable tensions in that, and it's not to reflect in any negative way on either the CEO or the board, but because both have quite different perspectives. So what was being in that fulcrum point?
Well, I have to say that, I mean, the board members were extraordinarily positive and understanding. I mean, so many of them are going through a similar situation in their other organizations they're involved in, either as board members or as CEOs or members of staff. So they're bringing that experience to bear. So it's not as if it's only these two organizations that have had to adjust. So what has been helpful is some, the wisdom of board members saying, well, in our organization, we approached it this way, or in our organization, we did it differently. And I know our CEO has been in touch with board members about our CEO, well, certainly in Thrower has been in touch with board members about different aspects of the way other organizations in the voluntary sector have responded to the pandemic. So that, I think, that has been very helpful. And I suppose it's probably helped the CEO build a better relationship with the rest of the board. So no, I haven't found any, there's been no board member, saying, oh, look, this is a total waste of time and we should, abandon all these government guidelines. I mean, there's no question of that. Everybody is signed up.
So there was good alignment around the board table about strategy.
Yeah.
There wasn't any big,
In fact, if our CEOs hadn't acted, the board members would have been wondering why on earth, given that every other organization has had to move online, why aren't we? But in fact, we just did it. And
so boards are used, like us all actually, boards are used to being, carrying out their governance role where there's a good level of stability and predictability. So you do 3-year plans or 5-year plans and budgets, things like that. Whereas in the last year, there was so much uncertainty. How did the board, I won't say cope, or how did the board engage with that high level of complexity and uncertainty?
Well, again, as I say, we in both cases we have a CEO's report. So those reports would have outlined the steps that had been taken to cope with the pandemic and meet with the government guidelines, and also, what activities were going on and what advances had been made in the organization. So the board members, I think, were very au fait with the work of the organization. They had the opportunity at board meetings and committee meetings to, quiz in greater detail. We've made in Thrower now, we made an effort for the last year, each member of staff has actually presented to the board about or at least, each member of staff was responsible for a service. And that, I think, has also helped board members to engage with the business in the practical business of keeping services going, and in some cases actually moving them on gently in the direction of the strategy.
Okay.
So so that really hasn't been a problem for the two organizations that I'm involved in. It might be for other organizations that have to provide a kind of hands-on service, but not in ours.
Okay. So my final question then is, so in 5 years' time, when you look back at this period, what would you like to be able to say about your leadership, or what would you like others to be saying about your leadership during this period?
First of all, that we survived,
Okay.
that we survived the pandemic in good shape, that and that people are safe and well as a result of, and that's something so far so good. I'm not aware of any of our board members or staff that have caught the virus. I hope that we'd be able to say that we kept to the mission of the organizations and managed to advance them, maybe not as fast or as extensively as we might have hoped, but that we're still in the business of that we have made progress in removing discriminations against unmarried parents and their children, and in advancing the research agenda within the St. John of God services. That the board is cohesive and is functioning well, and in fact maybe even functioning better as a result of the I suppose what we might call bonding that was necessitated by the crisis posed by the pandemic.
And what about your contribution as chair? What would you like people to be able to say about your contribution as chair?
Well, she did the right thing. that's all you can do. You can hope as chair that she supported the CEO, that she kept the board informed of what was happening in the organization, that they were on top of the finances and any challenges there, which is always a huge issue, and that we stuck to our mission, which in both cases we were able to make progress, even if not as fast as we might have hoped.
Okay. Ruth, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation and sharing with me your experience of chairing both of those organizations. I wish you and both organizations the very best for the remainder of 2021. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. Thank you. A pleasure talking to you.